The language running your decisions was written by people you've never met. You just call it your personality. What if the story you live inside was engineered before you could question it? There's a concept in behavioral economics called the default effect. It's simple, almost embarrassingly so. When people are enrolled in something automatically, the vast majority stay enrolled, even when opting out takes less than 60 seconds. Organ donation rates, retirement savings, insurance plans, across every domain. Researchers have tested, the default wins. Not because people choose it, because choosing requires friction, and the architecture of most systems is designed to make the default frictionless. That's not a bug, it's the whole point. What most analyses of this phenomenon stop short of saying is the part that actually matters. The default was set by someone. Every system of defaults, cultural, linguistic, institutional, psychological, was designed by someone, at some point, with some intent. And most people live their entire lives inside defaults they never examine because those defaults were installed before they had the cognitive tools to recognize a default when they saw one. This isn't cynicism, it's history. The Roman Catholic Church understood this mechanism with clinical precision for centuries. The doctrine of infant baptism wasn't purely theological, it was architectural. Set the symbolic framework before the mind develops critical distance from it, and that framework stops feeling like a framework. It feels like reality itself. The child doesn't grow up believing the doctrine. The child grows up perceiving through it. Wait, because this goes further than religion. The same logic appears in how nation-states construct identity, in how corporations engineer brand loyalty, in how social platforms design feeds that feel like your preferences, when they are actually reflections of your engagement patterns back at you, slightly amplified, slightly distorted. The specific content changes. The architecture doesn't. There is documented research on what anthropologists call primary symbolic encoding. The symbols and narratives absorbed before the age of 7 don't get stored as beliefs, which can be revised. They get stored as perceptual filters, which shape what information you notice, what you dismiss, what you're capable of imagining as possible. You don't remember learning them. You experience them as your sense of how the world works. Here's something almost no one tells you about that. The filters aren't neutral. They were constructed, and the people who constructed them, whether rulers of ancient city-states, architects of colonial education systems, or behavioral psychologists hired by tech companies, understood something that most people don't. You don't need to control what someone believes if you can control the framework inside which they form beliefs. That's a different level of operation entirely. It doesn't require surveillance. It doesn't require force. It requires only that the symbolic architecture be installed early enough, thoroughly enough, and consistently enough that the person inside it never develops the perceptual vocabulary to describe what they are inside. Because you can't question a framework using only the tools the framework gave you. How symbolic language became the infrastructure of power. Every major system of organized power in recorded history has relied on a body of symbolic knowledge that was not available to everyone. That's not a controversial claim. It's documented in the architecture of every significant civilization. Egyptian temple complexes had an outer court open to common worshippers, and an inner sanctum restricted to initiates. The outer ritual and the inner ritual were not the same. Greek mystery schools, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean brotherhood, the Orphic tradition, operated on explicit tiers of knowledge, with access to deeper symbolic layers contingent on demonstrated understanding of previous ones. The medieval guild system encoded trade knowledge in symbolic form specifically to restrict it to those who had earned access. The Hermetic tradition of Renaissance Europe circulated texts deliberately written to be opaque to the uninitiated. The pattern isn't hidden, it's just not usually framed for what it is. Symbolic knowledge was infrastructure. It was how power organized itself, transmitted itself, and protected itself from dilution. And the consistent principle across all of these systems, what unites an Egyptian high priest, a Pythagorean mathematician, a Rosicrucian alchemist, and a modern McKinsey partner, is that the knowledge they held wasn't primarily mystical, it was operational. It described how human psychology actually works, how perception can be shaped, how narrative can be installed, and how symbols can be used to direct behavior without the subject being aware that their behavior is being directed. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Here's what almost no one notices about where this leads. The consolidation of symbolic literacy, the capacity to read and deploy these systems consciously, has historically correlated almost perfectly with the consolidation of institutional power. It's not that understanding symbols makes you powerful. It's that the people who accumulate power tend, reliably, to invest in symbolic sophistication while simultaneously allowing symbolic literacy in the general population to atrophy. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Modern advertising is the largest deployment of applied symbolic psychology in human history. Hundreds of billions of dollars spent annually on understanding exactly which images, words, sounds, and sequences bypass conscious evaluation and reach the limbic system directly. The people designing those systems understand cognitive architecture in ways that would have been recognized immediately by any serious initiate of a classical esoteric tradition. They know about priming, about archetypal activation, about the difference between symbols that inform and symbols that operate. The people those systems are deployed against, overwhelmingly, have no equivalent framework for what's happening to them. Drop a comment if you've felt this asymmetry without being able to name it. You might be closer to the edge of something important than you realize. Why? The symbols that control you most are the ones that feel like truth. There's a specific quality that distinguishes an effective control symbol from an obvious one. The obvious symbol announces itself. You see the manipulation, and you can resist it. The effective symbol doesn't announce itself. It presents itself as reality, not as one possible interpretation of reality, but as the thing itself, unmediated, obvious, simply how things are. This is what the Hermetic tradition called the invisible operation, not magic in the theatrical sense. The precise placement of a symbol into a context where it would be perceived as nature rather than construction. Edward Bernays understood this more clearly than almost anyone in the 20th century. His insight, and he was explicit about it in writing in 1928, was that the most powerful way to shape mass behavior was not to persuade people, but to reshape the symbolic environment in which they made decisions, so that certain choices would feel natural and others would feel aberrant. He didn't call it symbolic engineering, he called it public relations. But here's the part that breaks the frame open. The techniques Bernays described and deployed successfully in campaigns that changed the dietary habits, political opinions, and consumer behavior of millions of people were not invented by him. He adapted them from his uncle Sigmund Freud's work on unconscious drives, combined with Le Bon's earlier research on crowd psychology. And both of those drew, whether explicitly or not, on a much older body of knowledge about how symbols interact with the unconscious mind. The Eleusinian initiates knew that certain symbols, experienced in certain states, produced irreversible shifts in how a person perceived themselves and their relation to the world. That wasn't speculation. It was documented across centuries of initiatory practice as reliable and reproducible. Modern psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins and NYU is now producing data that describes essentially the same mechanism, in the same terms, with clinical precision. Symbols alter perception permanently under the right conditions. Now consider what conditions exist today. Attention fragmented across dozens of platforms, each optimized for maximum emotional activation. Identity increasingly constructed through symbolic consumption. What you watch, share, wear, align with publicly. Algorithmic feeds designed to identify which symbolic combinations produce the strongest emotional responses in your specific profile and serve you more of them. And beneath all of it, the ancient symbolic archetypes: the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the authority, operating in the same predictable patterns they always have. Now deployed at industrial scale by systems with more behavioral data than any priest, propagandist, or Pythagorean ever had access to. This is invisible symbolic control over human decisions, not as a conspiracy, but as infrastructure, built openly, operated transparently, documented in quarterly earnings reports. If this is shifting something in how you see the systems you move through daily, the like matters. It tells the algorithm that this kind of investigation deserves to reach people who need it. That's not performance. That's how this works. How seeing the symbol changes what the symbol can do to you. Here's the paradox that sits at the center of all of this, and it's the most practically useful thing in this entire investigation. Awareness doesn't neutralize the symbol, but it changes the relationship. When a symbol operates below conscious recognition, it functions as a direct input to the systems that govern behavior, emotion, motivation, identity, decision. The response it produces feels like your response, feels like preference, feels like judgment. There is no gap between stimulus and reaction because the gap was never open. When you develop the capacity to recognize the symbol as a symbol, to see the architecture while it's operating, something shifts. The symbol still activates the same neural pathways. The emotional response is still real. But now, there is a moment, brief, often, between the activation and the action. And in that moment, something that wasn't available before becomes available. Viktor Frankl described that gap as the location of human freedom. He arrived at that conclusion in conditions most of us will never face. But the mechanism he described is the same one that serious esoteric traditions have built entire systems around for thousands of years. The Stoics called it prasosh, attention directed inward toward the process of one's own perception. The Hermetic tradition called it the opening of the eye, not metaphorically, but as a precise description of the cognitive shift that occurs when someone develops the capacity to observe their own symbolic processing in real time. What Tibetan Buddhist practice calls recognition of the display, seeing phenomena as they arise, without immediately collapsing into them as reality, is the same operation in a different cultural architecture. And here's something no one talks about in these discussions. This capacity was historically treated as dangerous. Not dangerous to the person who developed it, dangerous to systems that depend on the symbolic architecture operating without recognition. Every major tradition that developed techniques for expanding symbolic awareness also developed a body of teaching about why this knowledge was restricted. Not because it was spiritually hazardous, because it made people harder to govern through the standard mechanisms. An initiate who could recognize the symbolic operations underlying political rhetoric, religious spectacle, and social hierarchy was not a more obedient subject. They were a different kind of person entirely. That's not mythology. That's documented in the suppression of mystery schools across multiple civilizations, in the systematic burning of esoteric libraries, in the consistent pattern of institutions treating symbolic literacy as subversion. What gets destroyed most aggressively is always the thing that, if widely understood, would change the terms of the agreement. The awareness you develop from here isn't a conclusion. It's a threshold. What exists on the other side of it, the specific mechanisms, the documented practices, the contemporary applications, go significantly deeper than what fits in a single investigation. The architecture runs through every major institution operating in your daily life. The symbols are not hidden. They are everywhere, openly visible, completely functional, and almost entirely unexamined. You just saw one layer of it clearly. There are others. If this investigation opens something, you can't close subscribe and turn on notifications, not as a habit, but because what comes next maps the specific systems, the specific symbols, and the specific people who have understood this for a very long time. The most effective cage is the one the occupant believes is the landscape.